aroha ki a koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou I raro te manu o Ngati Pikiao. Me ngā whānau o tēnei rohe me te moana nui ākiwa. He te maitiau o te tai rāwhiti. So māhaki, Ngati Onione, whānau ākai, rongo whakaata ngai tāmanu hiri. My connections here, my great-grandmother, Barbara Allen Grant, was born in Te Arawa, in Te Puke, and she's Ngati Rangi Wewehi, Ngati Rangi e Ngati Rangi Nui. And, yeah, my tai rāwhiti whānau, okay? So, in lieu of the introduction, there's a little blurb about me in the book. Because that's the goal. And I would also a shout out to the organisers. It's lovely to come to a conference that is colour coordinated with my outfit. But I'm here talking about Takataapui well-being. How many people, quick show of hands, who know what Takataapui means? Oh, bye. So the word Takataapui comes from the writings of Ngati Rangi Wewehi scholar, Weremu Te Rangi Kaheke, in his kōrero about Hinemoa and Tutanekai. And so the kōrero goes that after that Tutanekai and Tiki were very, very close friends, intimate friends of the same sex. And after he began his relationship with Hinemoa, he went to his father and he said, I'm dying for love of my beloved, my Takataapui, Tiki. And it is said that Hinemoa allowed Tutanekai to maintain that friendship with Tiki. It's a word that was found in his manuscripts. He learnt to write in 1835, and a lot of George Gray's, all those early books that were written about Māori mythology and history were his work. And so a huge debt that we have to Te Arawa generally for that kōrero. In the work of, again, Te Arawa scholar, Takataapui scholar, Ngā Huia Te Awa Kōtuku and Lee Smith found that reference, and they, throughout the 80s and 90s, promoted it around Māori lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex and queer networks as a term that we could use which connects us to our ancestors and evolve that word to include and become an identity for us today. Obviously, I'm Takataapui. I came out as a lesbian when I was about 16. I am cisgendered, which means that I was born, I identify with the gender or the sex that I was born as, which is female, because many of our whānau do not, and live a really difficult life because of that. So I always want to acknowledge. So, let's see. Oh, cool. So making that definition for Takataapui. So given that is a definition, a contemporary way that we've adapted that word to mean all of us, how many of you would have Takataapui in your whānau? Exactly. And so, as we say, this is, when I was working, I was the Kaimahi Takataapui Taiohi for the Out There Queer Youth Project many years ago, and we did this resource just to say, who are we? We are Māori first. That is the point. And when we want to identify in all the different genders and sexualities that we have, we do that from our whakapapa and our Māori identity. So now these are some of my artworks, because sometimes for me, it's easier for me to think through things and express myself through art. So this one is around mana tupuna. Our ancestors who lived before us, who were both same-sex attracted, who fell in love with each other, but also who were what they call gender non-conforming now, which is perhaps they tried to live lives or just did things where they didn't quite fit in with how they were expected to be or live. And because with colonisation, of course, the English brought over many, many different kinds of constructs, and we adapted and we stopped doing a lot of different parts of our culture that came under attack, and in addition to our language and our spirituality. And one of those was our sexuality, a big part of that. So what the British brought across in the late 1880s was a kōrero around you were either heterosexual, which was normal and straight, or you were homosexual, which was deviant, abnormal, and of course, for the British, illegal. And what that did was we know from our Maori narratives, we know from the diaries of sailors, whalers, soldiers, and missionaries that the same sex and both sex loving practice happened in our culture. We know that happened throughout this country. What the British did, though, was that started to separate us as Māori off between people who did that and people who were over here, instead of us all just being whānau. And what that started to institutionalise then was homophobia and transphobia. Hating, being scared of somebody purely because of who they loved, and hating or fearing somebody purely because they did not fit the stereotype of what a real man or a real woman is meant to be. And of course, the British had some pretty crazy ideas about what a real woman is meant to be. This is another work, Mana Wahine. My contemporary versions of tukutuku. So the top panel, the top design, the roimata tōroa, just acknowledging all of our wahine ancestors. The fact that when the British came, they brought with them a way of thinking that said women and children were the chattels, they were the property of men. That the violence against women and children, rape, incest was commonplace, but it happened within the domain of the home, which was controlled by the king in his castle. So very, very different from what we know our original state of being as women was. But what it also did was it served to twist again, in effect, what is a real woman, what is a real man? And that has a huge impact on somebody then who doesn't fit into those. The words that some of our even present day Takataapui get called around being sissies, around being too butch, or you're just not quite a woman enough. And particularly for our trans people who are born in a body different to how they would prefer to identify, and then trying to create a life inside that. Many of our whānau really accepting, because even back then, there's a lot of evidence that our whānau were like, what is the problem? There's not actually an issue here. If you want to love this person, just go ahead. It's not a problem. And what they did was they started to hide it from view. And I think over time, what happened was as something gets hidden from view, they started to separate out. They thought, being Māori, doing these things, that's okay, but talking about it, giving yourself an identity around it, that's a bad thing. That is a Pākehā thing. So that even today, we said if you call yourself a lesbian, you're being Pākehā. That it's a non-Māori thing to accept those terms. And so that is why it's always a relief for many of us to be able to embrace the term Takataapui. So, just one moment. Quite often when I've spoken at things or when I talk to people and they say, you know, is that true that that happened? There's little bits of research, absolutely. When I was 16 and I came out, I hitchhiked from Dunedin to Gisborne to talk to my great-grandmother who was born in 1901. And I asked her, I told her, explained what it was about, and she said, that's fine. She goes, she had aunties who lived together as couples. Now, those aunties had to have been born in the late 1800s. And so nobody can shake me on this. But she did say, of course, you still have to have your children. Make sure you have your kids. It's like, yeah, it's fine who you love, but have your children. That is our job. And so when people are hassling me, it's like, yep, there's research and there's all of this, but that's what my nan told me. I can't be shaken on that. And so the other impacts around this, I come from Tai Rāwhiti, we were known for our women leaders, and we're now, in I think one of the most recent reports that have come out, we continue to be the highest rate of domestic violence in the country. So in a very, very short period of time, we have done a complete about flip, and I think there are many strategies that have been talked about in this room that are relevant for suicide prevention, and I think they're relevant for stopping violence and abuse inside our whānau throughout. And I'm thankful to have heard the kōrero and been part, because I work around, I advocate for Takataapui, but I see that in the context always of our whānau, because we are not separate from it. And I guess part of the attraction for people who are Takataapui is that it's actually an identity where we can be all of ourselves all at one time. So often we have to choose. And sometimes in lesbian gay communities, in the wider, we call LGBTIQ or rainbow communities, we had to leave our Māori-ness at the door. I started a group, Te Whanawhana. Actually, this work here, Mana Takataapui, this was purchased by Parliament to commemorate passing of the Marriage Equality Act. Random, yeah. This one, Te Whanawhana. But I founded Te Whanawhana in 2000 as a rōpū to try to bring together all the different parts of ourselves. Because it wasn't just a nuisance being Takataapui, you weren't just a little bit hassled. We've gone from the days of being hassled, you can still get beaten up walking down the street holding your girlfriend's hand. And Moira is going to touch, from Mental Health Foundation, is going to touch on some of that broad discrimination that affects all of our communities. Takataapui have some real specific things that happen, and one of those is that we have to separate ourselves. And when we go home, some whānau don't want to know you've got a same-sex girlfriend. They don't want you to bring your partner to their things, because then they might have to explain things to their whānau. Young people are being kicked out of home for telling their whānau that they're lesbian or gay. A lot of our older people think everything's all right for young people. We've had homosexual law reform here since 1986. It is not all right. And so, again, Moira will give some of those statistics of where we fit. And, of course, it's just all a lot of work required to address. And so some of those things that we talk about in our group is, if someone has transitioned from male to female, is it okay for them to do karanga? Can they just do it if they're in a rainbow group, or is it okay to go and do that at home? If a young person has transitioned while they're in a kapahaka group, can they change lines? Have a think about all of you who are involved in kapahaka, how easy is that conversation to have? We are involved. And again, that pressure to have children. It's my mother, little Pākehā lady, she helps with PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. She goes and works with she counsels parents and grandparents to try and tell them it's okay if your children don't have children. But also, just because you're Takataapui, if you're a lesbian and gay couple particularly, you still can have children. That cultural imperative can be met, but also there's ways around it. There's a lot of children that need our love in the world. And as I say, many whānau do accept their Takataapui members, but we're working on a resource we're going to talk about briefly to help those whānau who have issues with that and have problems. Because, of course, not being accepted by your whānau when you're young. Thank you, Aroha, for your kōrero and bringing up around sexuality, because it's that core whānau. If your core whānau don't accept you for who you are, and you are disconnected from them, that disconnects you from being Māori. And this is a core issue with this. And whether that abuse comes from alcohol, drugs, or just not having that acceptance of being who you are, then you lose touch with that. Through Te Whanawhana and other Takataapui groups, we try to connect Takataapui back to who they are, and then be able to just calm things down, to build up some of that resilience, to learn more of their whakapapa, to have a place to speak Māori, to do kapahaka, to live our tikanga, so that then they can go back home and continue to have that conversation. Much easier to hold that conversation when you're older, got a few resources, got a few clues behind you. Much harder when you're young. Much, much harder So we advocate for people to be the allies in the whānau. We say to young people, if your immediate family are not cutting it, who is the most influential person in your whānau? Go to them. And if you have to go outside of the whānau, then really they're ending up in your services. And I hope that you've got some things to tell them about that. A couple of the other resources. This one is a rainbow, these both are rainbow youth ones. It's called a Queer and Trans Guide, and it's a definition book. What are some of the terms that get used, what that means? We only have one of those. And I have a few of these if you want to come and grab some, but this came out a couple of weeks ago, relationship book, because we do know that in a marginalised, really tiny community, and you're trying to find somebody like you to have relationships with, that can be really difficult just to start with. And if something goes wrong, that is even more difficult to deal with. There's a section in here called My Top Tips, My Top Relationship Tips. And this is, I believe, I do a lot of mentoring and leadership training with young people in our communities, and 23 years with my partner, Alofa Iono, I'm married to Samoan, and we always aim to model strong, healthy relationships. Just flicking through these, okay, performing, of course you've got to perform, got to look, because our group, Te Whanawhana, and a lot of the Takataapui movement, of course, is based on being Māori, then whānau and whakapapa and whanaungatanga are key. So here, we're just acknowledging some of our elders, and see people who came into Wellington, of course, when they were in their 60s and 70s and living, especially our trans women, who, when the only work they could get was on the street as sex workers. So, of course, they've revolutionised the sex work industry in this country. And some of our Pākake, the most youth movements as they work around the country are very much youth-led, youth doing their thing. Because of our involvement, we aim to embrace all young people, because we understand that our Takataapui youth are connecting up with other people in their communities. And so we aim to always be here. Here's groups, some of Karen and Peri, well, people who are trans, people who are intersex, and people who are gay and lesbian. So this is, we do youth leadership training so that our older young people can provide services and support for our younger youth. So it's not always it's always clearly not our job to do that. They can get on and do a ton of things without us. And of course, giving young people the opportunity to be part of our tikanga, to take leadership roles inside our culture. This is at one of the Kaha Youth Hui. Most, of course, pure numbers, 90% of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex and queer young people in this country, of course, are Pākehā and from other cultures. And Māori's just a tiny part, but because of our involvement with them, us taking, I guess, I'm the eldest in my whānau. I expect to, get things done. And I expect to look after and be responsible for the young people in my family. And so I feel the responsibility as an elder in this community to look after. I call them my kids. I don't like it when anyone mucks with my kids, but I understand to look after our Takataapui kids, we have to look after all of the kids. And this is my last slide for this section. This was a work, I wanted to get my art out to where more Māori were. So in Gisborne, I did artwork for all of the meeting rooms at the probation offices when they built them, and in the family court. This one is in the whānau room of probation, and it's called Te Pito o Te Ao. So remembering the kōrero that Naida gave about love yesterday, and I always think Māori do not have an art symbol that means the word love. We have no equivalent to the love heart in English art design or Western art design. My favourite way that this is in the koiri, the role of the parent looking after the child. I say that we are all, my generation, we are the parents of that whole generation of young people. We will heal and look after those ones when all of us look after all of them. And so I'm going to hand over to Moira, and she will do the next part, and we'll come back to you. Kia ora.
reiho. Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi aroha ki a koutou. Ko te raroa te iwi, ko ngai tūpoto ki motukaraka te hapu, ko Moira Clunie aho. The rest of my tupuna came from Scotland, England, Ireland and Orkney. I work at the Mental Health Foundation of New Zealand, where I'm the Service Development Manager. So I'm responsible for our programs related to suicide prevention and also some of our new and developing initiatives related to youth wellbeing and the wellbeing of rainbow or LGBTI Takataapui communities. The Mental Health Foundation focuses on creating a society where all people can flourish, that is, experience meaning, purpose, wellbeing and positive mental health. And I guess I just wanted to give a bit of context around why this kaupapa, Takataapui wellbeing, is a central part of suicide prevention. Even though it's not always spoken about, I just want to mihi again to Michael Naira, who invited us to bring this kaupapa into the room, and also mihi to Aroha for mentioning it earlier. Mental health, mental illness and suicide are particular issues for Takataapui, as well as for non-Māori people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, whawhawhine, genderqueer, akawāine, let's say sexual and gender minorities, which is one of the terms that's used in research. Sexual and gender minorities in New Zealand are at significantly higher risk of mental health problems and suicide compared to other New Zealanders, and the main reason for this is rejection, social exclusion and discrimination, some of the issues that Elizabeth was speaking about. So I wanted to just say a little bit about that and talk about some approaches to address this. So to start with a quick look at the research evidence. When I'm talking about research, I'm not just talking about Māori. There's very little research specifically about Takataapui wellbeing. But remember that in every one of the identity groups that I mentioned, there are Māori. So there are Māori gay men, there are transgender Māori, and so on. And rangatahi Takataapui, tangata Takataapui face higher risk of mental health problems from two directions, related to those factors that Māori are more likely to experience or face, and related to those factors related to sexuality or gender identity. The report up on the slide, Te Pou o Te Whakaronui, published a needs assessment report in 2012 as part of the government's Suicide Prevention Action Plan, which found that gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender and intersex people have significantly higher lifetime risk for depression, anxiety, suicide and self-harm, substance use and eating disorders. So this study looked at a whole range of local and international evidence, while noting that local evidence is fairly limited, especially for Māori and Pacific, for intersex, for some of those smaller population groups. Just one study the report looks at is the Christchurch Health and Development Study, which found in 2005 that men who were gay or predominantly homosexual had over 5 times the rate of mental health problems compared with straight men, including suicide attempts and suicidal ideation. So 28.6% of gay men reported attempting suicide, compared with 1.6% of straight men. 76% reported suicidal ideation or thoughts, compared with 11% of straight men. And lesbians had about 30% higher rates of major depression, compared with heterosexual women. The Youth 2000 project from the Adolescent Health Research Group at Auckland Uni is another major study in this area that's conducted 3 large-scale population health studies of secondary school students across the country. The 2012 study, the most recent, found that high school students who said they were attracted to the same or both sexes or who were transgender had higher rates of depression, suicide attempts and self-harming than their peers. So in both of those groups, 1 in 5 students had attempted suicide in the last year. So they were about 5 times as likely to attempt suicide compared with their peers. And I don't want to spend too long on these stats because they're kind of awful, but just another point of comparison, looking at Māori students as a group, 6.5% had attempted suicide in the last year in the same time. This was about twice as many as their Pākehā peers, but for sexual and gender minority students, including Takataapui Māori as a group, 20% had attempted suicide. They were 5 times as likely compared with their straight, cisgendered peers. Rates of depression for same and both sex attracted students also significantly increased between 2001 and 2012, a pattern that wasn't seen among opposite sex attracted students or among Māori as a group. We see similar patterns in overseas research, and again, we don't have very much local data, Sexuality and gender diversity are not counted at population level within health services, they're not in coronial records related to suicide deaths, they're not recorded in the census or the disability survey, they're not routinely included as demographic markers in health or mental health research, with a few notable exceptions. But the research we do have paints a pretty consistent picture, and it's not a very good one. So it's really important, I guess, with this sort of depressing stats part out of the way, to say that identity itself is not the cause of mental health problems. Takataapui have exactly the same potential to flourish and live beautiful, purposeful lives as everyone else. A disproportionate number go through a hard time, but simply having these identities doesn't determine negative outcomes. The Youth 12 research I mentioned earlier found that same and both sex-attracted young people, most transgender young people, were happy or satisfied with their lives. Most thought their school was okay, most had friends they felt they could talk to about anything and who cared about them a lot, and most of them had at least one parent who they said cared about them a lot as well. The Lavender Island study from Massey University found that gay, lesbian, bisexual identity can be a source of strength in itself in later life. So the negative outcomes, the negative stats, are not about identity themselves. There's nothing wrong, harmful, pathological about being takataapui, being gay, lesbian, bisexual, intersex, whawhawhine, genderqueer, queer, all these wonderful diverse identities. These higher rates of problems are caused by rejection, exclusion, and discrimination, causing stress and distress. This effect is sometimes talked about as minority stress. That is the idea of chronic stress related to being part of a stigmatised identity group. It's sort of kind of similar to how racism operates in terms of mental health. It's not as simple as just family rejection or just school bullying. Those can be part of it, but it's really describing the effect of growing up in a society that assumes that who you are isn't quite right. So common experiences that can contribute to minority stress might include direct violence or bullying, insults, threats and verbal abuse, rejection from families or communities, practices that favour people who follow the standard heterosexual life path, have babies, higher rates of exposure to sexual assault, secrecy and shame associated with intersex conditions, being born not clearly male or female, and the medical procedures that are often still associated with those, internalised stigma or a lack of positive self-concept due to growing up in an environment that doesn't accept or validate an individual's identity, invisibility through assumptions that everyone's straight and everyone has a standard gender identity, and it can also include lack of access to safe, effective health and social services due to limitations in systems and practitioner understanding. So just briefly, for example, the Youth 12 study found that the health and wellbeing of many same or both sex-attracted and trans students was negatively affected by their social environment at school. Almost 1 in 5 reported bullying on a weekly or more frequent basis. But on the other side, acceptance can be explicitly protective. So, frequently or elsewhere, they were much, much less likely to make a suicide attempt if supported by at least one family member. And various studies have found links between supportive schools and less risk. So, for example, Youth 2000 again found that in supportive schools across Aotearoa, gay and bisexual boys had much lower rates of depression and suicidality compared with those that were in unsupportive schools. So how do we address this? I guess I'm suggesting, similarly to what Elizabeth was saying, we need to prioritise inclusion, aroha, unconditional acceptance, and challenge discriminatory attitudes and behaviours wherever they exist. This is a lot of work, but it's also really simple. It's just about people being good to one another. And I wanted to, on that note, share with you one of my people, my grandma, Jean Isabel Clunie. It's through her that I whakapapatu te Raroa. She grew up in Fiji. She wasn't connected with Te Ao Māori at all, really, but she embodied aroha and manakitanga, I think. Grandma spent most of the last years of her life into her 90s living in an apartment just off Karangahape Road in Auckland. She'd walk up K Road to do her grocery shopping or to find presents for one of her many grandchildren or great-grandchildren. For those who aren't from Auckland, K Road is one of the most visibly queer spaces in the city. It's where you'd go to find rainbow youths, hangout space, or gay bars, or rainbow flags on shops. Pretty fun place. So Grandma was surrounded by this, but the one time I remember talking to her about gay people, she told me a story about suicide. She was born and grew up in Fiji, spending some of her time in Sydney at boarding school. She told me about a friend of her brother's, part of their social circle when they were teenagers. He'd had relationships with men, but it wasn't really talked about. They kind of knew it was going on, but they didn't really know much about what he got up to, and it was illegal. He'd learned that the police knew about him and were planning to arrest him, and he killed himself. Grandma told me it doesn't matter what you think about gay people and what they do in their bedrooms. Nothing is worth that. Everyone should be free to love who they love. Nothing is worth that. Something Elizabeth says is, you don't have to get it, you just have to be there. And nothing is worth that. It's an intuitive truth that accepting people for who they are is part of the task of suicide prevention. People understand this, that Takataapui will be less likely to be suicidal if they're accepted, valued, and have a place in their whānau and community. Kim Dwyer's daughter came out as trans, and she's pursuing a modelling career in Auckland. Kim told the Herald, "I'm okay with it now. I wasn't at the start, obviously. I was in denial, to be fair." He said he blamed Amy's mother at first and tried to force her to play sports to change her. Quote, "I don't know much about transgenders, so obviously I've learned a little bit in the last 6 months, that's for sure. If you're not going to support them, they're going to get, I would say, suicidal, to be fair," Mr. Dwyer said. Whānau shapes young people. Having at least one family member who supports them makes it far more likely that Takataapui will grow up well. This doesn't just mean tolerating a person. Look, it's okay if you're gay, but don't talk about it at home. This is about extending that same unconditional aroha to Takataapui, offering respect and dignity. It's about getting over whatever judgment you might be holding and treating each other well. It might be about inviting your son's boyfriend to the same whānau events as your daughter's husband, or it might be about actively advocating to your school's board of trustees to let your whakawahine daughter wear the girl's uniform, not just leaving all of that struggle on her shoulders alone. It might be about educating yourself a bit. One of the projects I lead is Common Ground, which is the first place to go for whānau and friends who are worried about a teenager's mental health. As part of this project, we developed information about gender identity and sexuality to give whānau and friends some clear, non-alarmist information about identity, including the social pressures that young people might be going through and how to be supportive. It provides information and advice, as well as referrals on to help services where they're needed. It might be about affirming their identity. Men Like Us is a video series we produced about 9 gay men in New Zealand. This is Todd Karehana, who talks about growing up in Kawerau, learning to accept his identity as Takataapui, gay and Maori. It might be about strengthening their self-esteem, resilience, life and coping skills. Their identity is not a problem, but they'll most likely face discrimination in the wider world because of who they are. You can help them to develop good habits to support their mental health. One of the tools we promote is the 5 Ways to Wellbeing, originally developed in the UK as a equivalent to the sort of 5+ a day fruits and vegetables type of campaign. So those are a few ideas for whānau to think about. There's more work to be done in our schools, workplaces, hapu, iwi and communities across Aotearoa to increase inclusion. But really everyone can contribute to this mahi within their own whānau and their own life. With this in mind, wanting to equip whānau to be more supportive, we started a project with Elizabeth last year, and we had funding from Wakahurua's Community Partnership Fund to support the partnership. The project, with the working title Takataapui 101, is creating a print and online resource to help whānau understand more about identity and how to support whānau members. So that'll be a written booklet, a website, and 5 video interviews with people who identify as Takataapui about their identity and wellbeing. And that'll be available in the next couple of months. I'll just quickly pass back to Elizabeth to introduce the 5 people we've worked with.
If you flick it, I'll read this. So while that's rolling, these are some of our participants. Part of my mahi is I'm just about to finish my PhD called Part of the Whānau, the Emergence of Takataapui Identity. And I spent some time in the States recently so I could stop doing activist work here and actually maybe finish it, get it written, and that's part of the delay for not having this resource already completed. But in the resource we come up with my 10, but one of the things one of my academic mates said was, oh, you're going to get people from other professors critiquing your work. And I said, I do not care what some white professor on the other side of the world says about mahi Māori. I'm worrying about the Māoris right here are going to say about what I do. So we have kind of our top tips, which will be in the resource, but this is how we pull it together. Takataapui means being Māori and being lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, queer, genderqueer, asexual, or questioning. Takataapui are part of the whānau, always have been, always will be. We all inherit our sexual orientation and gender identities from our ancestors, whatever that may be. Being takataapui does not foster depression and suicide, discrimination does. Mana wahine is the platform for fighting discrimination against takataapui. We sort out our gender issues, we will sort out pretty much everything else. Takataapui connects us to being Māori in environments supportive of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. Takataapui celebrates and honours our unique Māori selves without apology or shame. Takataapui implies diversity without having to give details. Thank you very much. And whānau don't need to get it, they just need to be there. And finally, be a takataapui ally to spread acceptance and challenge discrimination within the whānau or wherever it occurs. Kia ora.
Hard to kill like the chronicles of Riddick. With silent cynics, tough them givers. Come on, yo. Tell your boys to blaze up, cause he to the roof up. Rip the stage up, when we rock, yo. It's not stop, yo. Yeah, push it, tell your boys to blaze up, cause he to the roof up. Rip the stage up, when we rock, yo. Take it to the top, yo. Make you a slave in my temple, say to this instrumental. Psycho MC, banging on your mental. No credentials are too much to handle. Break it down nice and simple. Keep this everlasting like the Valley of Kings. Counts in hip-hop and simple boy like Siamese twins. Though it's flowing in life you've ever heard. Destroying your team, you still get to learn. It's the return to the king, that God of the rings. Incredible, remarkable. Represent New Zealand in the field, giving it real. Still ripping home boy, you know the deal. If raps are Cindy, Carpe Diablo, Vatican style and remove a rival. Fighting the 13 drops of Psycho. Blowing out spots, I'm so silent. Come on, yo. Tell your boys to blaze up, cause he tear the roof up. Rip the stage up, when we rock, yo. It's all stop, yo. Yeah, listen, tell your boys to blaze up, cause he tear the roof up. Rip the stage up. Okay. You guys ready? Yo, we got to break. Oh, move. Oh, rock. Fire, fire, calm down. Fire, calm down. Break, 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 break.